So welcome everybody. We're just giving everybody a moment to come in.
Gea, are you going to give me a heads up when I should start?
Sure. I
I'm
mean,
not sure how many people are lined up or in the waiting room, so
but I cannot see.
it seems like people are coming in right now.
Yeah. Well, let's give it another minute for everybody to get in, and I'm sure still some people will come in a bit later.
Yes.
Yeah. So shall we start?
Should we start? Yes. Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful that you're joining us here today for our web seminar, Intergenerational Feminist Dialogue. On behalf of the Frederick Ebert Foundation and White Plus, I would very warmly like to welcome you. It's wonderful that so many of you have found the way to join us in this conversation that we're having here today. I would just like to very briefly introduce the hosting organizations. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation is the oldest political foundation in Germany that links to the core ideas of social democracy and the values of freedom, justice, and solidarity. It works autonomously and independently. Thanks for joining forces, Friedrich Ebert Foundation and White Plus. White Plus is a European feminist network of women's rights advocates and gender specialists, as well as women's rights organizations and development NGOs. Currently, White Plus's work focuses mostly on migrant women's rights, intersectional feminist movement building, gender just trade policies, and feminist economic issues such as the digital economy or trade, as I said. So this is very much part of the feminist movement building that the dialogue that we're having today. And I'm in a second going to introduce the three wonderful speakers who are entering the conversation with us today. Very briefly, my name is Silke Steinhilber. I'm part of White Plus, and I have, as a researcher and consultant, worked on transformative feminist policies and supported and been part of this endeavor to strengthen global feminist movements and to broaden our views toward an inclusive and intersectional approach. There are very few practicalities, housekeeping issues that I would like to mention before we enter the conversation. First is the conversation is being interpreted. So in case you need to listen or would like to listen to the interpretation, you need to go to the bottom of your screen where you see the globe icon, and you can choose interpretation into Spanish and French, and mute the original audio, obviously. The seminar will last for an hour and a half. and it is being taped and live streamed. If you would like to contribute by asking a question or making a comment, we would like to please urge you to use the chat rather than the icon to lift your hand, simply because it's easier to follow the order and to not get lost between the different channels. So please do use the chat if you would like to raise a point, and also if you have anything to share pertaining to this webinar. We are hoping to have enough time to put you on live if you would like to do that, if you would like to raise your question yourself. Otherwise, please put it in writing. A few of us organizers are monitoring the chat, and we will make sure, if possible, time-wise permitting, to bring your question to the attention of the speakers. Also, if you need to raise your question in Spanish or French, obviously that's possible. Please do put it in writing, and we will make sure it is being translated. As I said, we are live streaming this, and we will making it available afterwards. If you would like to remain anonymous when asking a question or making a comment, you are free to choose to rename yourself in the Zoom program. And last but not least, I hope that's self-understood, but we are really, as White Plus, as FAS, we're committed to a friendly and civilized exchange and interaction. And I would like to point out that we're reserving our right to exclude anyone who is or uses offensive or discriminatory language, or who intends to abuse this space. All right, let's dive into the topic of intergenerational feminist dialogues, and what does it mean? How does intergenerational approaches, how do intergenerational approaches form part of intersectional approaches? As you see, we're embarking on a quite broad topic, and this is why I would like to alert you to the fact that this conversation is part of a series of conversations that White Plus and the FAS are jointly organizing. And you're very warmly invited to join the subsequent conversations as well. There's one focusing more on racism, classism, and gender discrimination as part of an intersectional feminist approach, which will take place on the 16th of November. Please join us. And there's another one entitled Joint Strategies of LGBTQI Rights and Feminisms, which will take place on the 30th of November. And links are being provided or will be provided in the chat. Please join us, register for the upcoming conversations as well. For today, I'm very, very happy to have three distinguished speakers and interactors, conversants with me, with us in this webinar. And I would like to very briefly introduce the three. We are having Marlise Andre with us, who's Marlise, yes, she's waving, who's a medical student and trans woman from South Africa, where she started her advocacy work. And as a German, I'm very happy to tell you that we're fortunate to have her in Germany nowadays, where she forms part of the International Women's Spaces group, Break Isolation. The International Women's Space is a known activist group and advocate for refugee women's rights and migrant women's rights, and against the lager system, where Germany is caging refugees in this so-called process of integration. So Marlise, I'm very happy you're joining us here today. Secondly, I'm more than happy to welcome Srilata Bhatliwala, who's from India, who's the senior advisor in knowledge building with CREA, with Creating Resources for Empowerment and Action. And she's been a long-standing international advocate on feminism and women's rights, and has worked in South Asia, East Africa, the Middle East, North Africa. So somebody with a wide perspective and history in advocacy, including with AWID and other grassroots and advocacy organizations in India and beyond. Srilata, I'm very pleased to have you here with us today. And the third person, I'm looking for her on my screen, is Twasima Bigirwa from Uganda. Twasima, very, very happy to greet you here and to have you here with us. Twasima is a feminist writer, lawyer, and activist who has worked on the public perception and treatment of minoritized people in Uganda for many years. Currently, she works for the Seagull Family Foundation, and she's also part of the advisory committee of FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. Twasima, I'm very happy you're joining us for the conversation here today. Welcome. Welcome to all three of you. For everyone, we're planning this as several rounds of conversations here. And after 3 rounds of conversations among the speakers, we are opening to you for questions or comments coming from the audience. And obviously the time is short, so please, to the three speakers, I'm already apologizing if I'm going to at some point have to cut you short, maybe, I don't know. But we are really trying to make space for everyone and to engage in a dialogue with our audience, as well as between the three of you or between us over here, up here, I almost said, but we're not working with a panel these days. So let's start with the first round of conversation, of questions between the three of you, which we thought it would really make sense to start from the personal, and as the personal is always political, and ask or reflect a little bit about what does feminism mean and practice for you and for your feminist experience, and how important is age next to other social categories and identities that shape us as persons, as activists, as citizens in political action. I would like to start with Twasima and invite you to tell us a little bit about how you came to form as a feminist, and what are the forces that shaped your feminist approach, and also to share with us a little bit your thinking about what are new generations of feminists bringing to activism in practical ways, but also in terms of theoretical perspectives. So Twasima, what made you a feminist, and what does it mean to you?
Thank you. What made me a feminist? I think firstly, the need to survive, right? I am an African-born and raised young woman. And, that comes with a lot of burdens and baggage and histories, right? And my experiences in the world have been shaped on a constant by who I am, right? Who I identify as deliberately, and who the world perceives me as. And so for me, feminism was first and foremost the acknowledgement that the world in which we exist in is extremely oppressive towards people who look like me and others, right? That was the first thing. And that this oppression is upheld by systems of power, right? And that to be able to undo those different legacies of oppression, it's important for me to be in community with others who look like me, but perhaps who don't look like me, but think like me and are invested in the same things. So feminism for me has been, over the years, the definitions have changed. Right now, I define it as a deliberate take on to take back my life and the lives of people that are important to me. And that's a daily resistance. But it's also so much joy and pleasure and finding community and all the things that I think are sometimes missing as we think about our own activism. The second one, I think, was around, do I think new generation of feminists bring in new perspectives, right, to feminist activism and practical ways of working? I'm a little uncomfortable with the term practical ways of working. I would like to think that what we need are perhaps radical or new imaginative ways in which we view the world, in which we view the problems of the world, and then how we thus address them, right? And I think 110%, it's important for younger voices to continue to emerge, right? Because it's new perspectives, it's different contexts, it's things that we have become blinded to ourselves over the years, right? So it's always important that we have those fresh perspectives. It's always important that those fresh perspectives do not seem to be contradictory or in competition of what has been existent, right? Because that's a very patriarchal understanding. We can all coexist and we can all learn from each other. And ultimately, we have to remain aware of what it is we're fighting. And that cannot be each other. It's not new generation feminists versus old ones. It's just being able to understand that things are shifting and we must shift with them and be able to just sit with where we all are on our different journeys as well. Yeah.
It struck me how you refer to this tension between self-identification and ascriptions, maybe we could call it, coming from the outside, and this need to juggle and to position oneself as how you self-identify, and then at the same time said people who look like you or who are placed in the same box like you, and this idea of learning from each other maybe is also the transition over to Marlies and your feminist activism and the concept of practical change that I've heard you refer to. What does this mean for you? What does feminist activism mean for you, and how do you see it as bringing about a change? And and how did you see differences or commonalities between different generations of feminists? And at the same time, your change of continents probably also crosses the idea of generations. Marlies, tell us a little bit.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Marlies. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here, to FES, Gia, and everyone at White Plus. I'm representing International Women's Space. So it's a very good question you asked. And I think for me, the concept of feminism is rooted basically on what I call Black feminism. Is that we women of color have been oppressed in terms of sexism, racism, and the failures to recognize and address these issues. So in terms of my feminism, I think of it like a merger between feminism and Black liberation, and that we women of color have our own agendas that only we understand and only we know how to go by about them, and that neither, how would I say this, that neither parties can come and take them on. So you find that when I talk about practical change, all this stems from that. It's seeing that daily problems that do not need board meetings of people to come and basically decide that we need to make a budget, we need to make a plan. And it's a simple thing as basically working in your community, helping those people that surround you. So the concept is actually dealing with daily problems we face on a daily basis. So this means we get to impact people directly where they're affected. We all have everybody who's trying to do big things to become a politician, to become change makers and all these people. And this has separated the idea of humane actions that people don't have towards common people. That's why you find that some people don't have an understanding when they're up there of the struggles that people go on a daily basis. So this is what I talk when I say practical change. Yeah. And basically also it's just that about the challenges we see and the challenges we face. So we take the concept of Black feminism, practical change, and we use that to address our main problems. In the Black community, we have problems that only we know and understand. So how does this affect me in my surrounding? It affects me because I find that I'm the only person, even in South Africa, I'm the only person who's speaking about this, the only person who's bringing the idea that feminism is evolving, that we also need to be inclusive enough to be able to adapt and change and be more inclusive to people like trans women. So I have experienced major differences in terms of like the feminist places that I go to, and it strikes me because feminism is so diverse, and at the core of the problem, we are all women who are united by basic problems that we face on a daily basis. How Twasima said it, a patriarchal culture doesn't look at us like white women, doesn't look at us like Black women, doesn't see us as trans women. When they're instituting gender pay gaps, they don't separate them and say this is for trans women and this is for normal women and everything like that. You know, that's the language they use. They don't do that. They look at us as women. So for me, I find that it's been a subtle change, and also that is an understatement actually, that the change of continent has helped me to see both sides of the story. You know, when you're in the global south, you look at things differently because you think that change can only comes maybe if perhaps we get more inclusive and we get more foreign investment, you know, but rather it's supporting more Black owned local businesses, supporting your, Twasima knows this, your own mama mboga down the street, the person selling vegetables. That's how we get to look at these problems, and that's how we get to uplift our own communities. So this now is what has been my model that I look back at when I address problems here in Germany. When I look at the refugee crisis, it's all a matter of statistics of how many people did we deport, how many people did we deal with, how many people get to do their interviews, how many people have Dublin in their cases, you know? But they never understand these problems that this person is an individual person that is a mom, a brother, a sister, and that all they're asking for is to be protected. So they never have these systems that look at a person from an individual basis. And that is what we also at International Women's Space are trying to fight. So I will wrap up by just summing all this to say that feminism is a very diverse concept, you know, and we are dealing with different problems from different perspectives. If you stand that side, I have a different view from this side. It's the same. But one thing that unites us all is that we are all women, just in different perspectives, just having different lives and different challenges. Thank you so much. I hope that explains the question.
I'm not sure it'll explain or respond to everything, because this is an invitation for conversation, right? And I'm fascinated by what you just said. It stuck with me how you said daily problems do not need board meetings. So really to start from day-to-day realities, and I find it interesting how your take on the daily is both opens a window to understand diverse situations and diversity, and at the same time opens a window towards unification or identification as a larger group. So in a way, it's contradictory, and that makes it interesting to me. It's both unification and diversification, I think, to start or to take on this this point of view. Let's maybe come to that again later. Or would you like to respond immediately? I see your hand.
I think it's two sides of the same coin, basically. If you look at the problem, the unification and diversification you're looking at is basically the reason I say that there needs to be some sort of diversification is that you find yourself that you don't have the space to be able to address the challenges you have, and when you're in a larger organization, or even an organization that is not so large but is steered by laws and has to adhere to certain forms of doing whatever they do, you find that if you're trying to push an agenda, it might be pushed back because majority of the people don't understand what you're talking about. You see, so this diversification is where I say that somehow when these problems arise, it's people like us who should be able to deal with them, but also in the unification, in the sense that we need to understand that this is a challenge for all of us. The global south at this point in time is the one facing these challenges, but who's to say in the next 1,000 years or in the next 500 years, when if we don't act on climate change, we are having all these problems, it will be then now we'll be having a different conversation. Who knows? So looking at it on a daily basis, it's basically we need to create more space. That's how we will be able to have the diversity that I'm talking about. Thank you so much.
I think creating space is the exact link to Srilata and your long commitment to feminist mentoring, as I would understand it, as one way of creating spaces and empowering each other. So Srilata, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on how you understand feminist mentoring as a mutual relationship. Because I think, especially in the context of an intergenerational dialogue, there might be a risk for mentoring to be understood as something from the old to the young. And I understand you as not seeing it this way. So I would like to invite you to tell us your personal story in this and your perspective on what is feminist mentoring as a mutually enhancing practice of creating spaces.
Sure. Thank you, Silke. So let me start by saying, sharing a few thoughts on this whole issue of, does age matter in feminist activism or not? I think it's a very broad question, but at one level, if I reflect on my own experience, on my own life's journey, I would be tempted to say it doesn't matter, because I look back at my own experience and I see that I did some of the most innovative, path-breaking feminist popular education and movement building work with a whole team of others, of fellow activists, fellow feminist activists, when we were in our 20s and 30s. And I don't remember anyone telling us or calling us young activists. That label was never applied to us. We were just considered, sort of passionate feminist activists. But on the other hand, I see that age does matter for the reasons that, Twasima mentioned, that we live in social contexts that are based on multiple power structures, and those power structures construct hierarchies of different kinds. One of those hierarchies is age. And in some cultures, particularly, age hierarchy is very strong. It's quite rigid. There are very, very sort of clear sets of expectations, rules, norms, and assumptions that emerge from those hierarchies. So partly for this reason, I think as I shifted more from, being primarily engaged in grassroots activism towards more of research and writing and scholarship, but most importantly, supporting the capacity building of young feminist activists in different parts of the world, I began to see that they were located in organizations where there were certain kinds of rigid hierarchies, some based on age, but also on multiple other things, on class, your educational background, ethnicity, race, caste, etc. And that while the training programs helped them to get a lot of clarity in understanding power and patriarchy and feminism, how patriarchy operates in societies, how it intersects with other power structures, how do you build a movement, how do you build a feminist movement, what's unique or different about feminist movement building. Yes, they got all the ideas, but they weren't able always to go back and act on them or operationalize them because there was no ongoing support system. And sadly, many of the organizations they came from, even the ones that call themselves feminists, did not provide that kind of encouragement and ongoing support. And this is what made us look at developing a sort of a theory and a practice of feminist mentoring. So in our feminist mentoring approach, we took the position that first of all, age and knowledge, or age and capacity, age and insight or experience are not necessarily correlated. And in fact, in our experience with this in South Asia, with 30 organizations across South Asia and young feminist activists they identified, we saw that the mentors whom we trained, the feminist mentors, the older mentors learned a lot from the younger activists they were mentoring, and younger mentors from older activists they were mentoring and older mentors. And after a fairly early point in the process, age became an irrelevant factor, at least in the mentoring space. What we also saw was exactly what Marlies was talking about, that this space became a kind of a arena in which we broke down those silos of, oh, this is my personal life challenge, this is the challenge in the organization, and this is the challenge in my, on the ground movement building work. It became a space which was where you could legitimately bring the challenges you were facing in any of these dimensions of your life. So we blurred those boundaries. So in other words, when we said personal is political, we made the self a site of change. So I won't go into further details. Of course, the Kriya manual, the Feminist Mentoring for Feminist Futures manual is available on our website. But I just want to say and echo both, I think, what Twasima and Marlies have said, that for me, for all these reasons, feminism is a pathway. It's a journey. It's not a destination. So there is no feminist utopia. But I think the reality is, with each set of gains that we make, new challenges rise up, new forms of backlash occur, and so they create new agendas for action. And if we have to sustain ourselves to keep going on this journey, we all need the support of mentors and of feminist mentors particularly. Thank you.
Wonderful, Srilata. I love this. Two quotes, the self as a site of change and feminism as a journey. However, I mean, if we, and you have referred to this, it's not feminism and relationships between feminists and within feminisms are not power-free spaces. So dialogue doesn't necessarily translate immediately into movement building, and we are brought up in systems of oppression, and there are so many intersecting categories, be it colonialism, be it gender norms, racism, classism, global inequalities, etc. So they permeate feminist spaces because we are part of them, and they have permeated us. So I would like to reflect with you a bit more on power within feminist organizations and movements, and how feminism can be a journey of not repeating, not perpetuating patterns of exclusion and power. Twasima, I would like to invite you to think a bit, why do you think that young feminist organizations are, as organizations of young feminists, are useful as models of political action? What makes them necessary and specific? And because you are part of this global network of promoting young activism, so and how can how can groups of young activists transform feminism as a global and or national movement, and resist the continuation of patterns of power and exclusion?
That's an interesting question. Firstly, I am 28. So by Uganda standards, I don't even know that I can call myself a young activist, because the maiden age is actually 15 years old, right? That's like the average, how old the average person is. And I'm also always curious. I've really never identified as a young feminist, but for some reason, that's a label that's followed me for, all my, I guess, activistic career or life. And I wonder why that is. I think it's important for us to reflect on why certain labels and certain language is important. Why is it important for me to be identified as a young feminist as opposed to a feminist? Like, what's that distinction? I'm curious about those, because I think that only if we sit and pause long enough to be able to think about why these labels are important to us and the ways in which we organize. And so when you invite a young feminist vis-a-vis a non-young feminist, is there a difference in treatment? If not, like, why is the label even important to begin with, right? So I think it's important for us to think through those, because those ultimately affect the ways in which we show up. It affects the ways in which we organize. It affects the ways in which we relate with people. I would also like for us to, I think that there is a danger, and I see this a lot in the ways in which we organize, specifically within civil society, is that there is a danger to limit our understanding of the feminist movement to just civil society organizing. And that's dangerous, right? And because first and foremost, we need to be able to sit with the ways in which this civil society way in which we organize around NGOs is within a specific system, right? And the ways in which that has continuously pushed these hierarchies and has institutionalized these different isms and these different systems of oppression, right? So we need to first and foremost begin to reimagine our organizing outside some of these systems. And for me, I think when I would remove the word young and replace it with radical. When I think radical feminist organizations, I think a challenge to those institutions. I think being able to have hard conversations. I think resistance of hierarchies, right? And insistence on actual inclusion, which is not tokenism, which is not, just faces there, right? I think for me, that's what I think that's what's important. And those are some of the lessons and models that I am invested in us mainstreaming, right? And those have nothing to do with age. Those have everything to do with our willingness to reimagine what is possible and to deliberately look beyond just these very specific boxes of organizing, which, you know, and it was Mariel was saying, like, things don't need board meetings, just do the work. And I think that we've gotten a lot of along the way, we have gotten so bogged down into things that ultimately take away from the cause. It means that we're having less radical conversations because we are instead invested in maintaining the status quo because it's currently benefiting us in one way or another. It means that we are refusing to hear when we're being called out and being asked to be held accountable. You know, it means that we're not showing up for our community and for our sisters in ways that we should, right? So only if we are able to really critically think about why these distinctions even exist in spaces like this, which we say are feminist, can we begin to unpack some of those hard truths?
I think that was a great point, like how categories are defined from probably always from a place of power. Like, who says you are young? Somebody who, or most often, somebody who considers herself older or more experienced? Question mark. A 15-year-old Ugandan activist would not call you a young feminist, probably. So to what extent are these categories permeated and defined from a place of power? Marlies, what's your thought about this invested in maintaining the status quo, and how can we overcome that in the struggle to transform power and relations of dominance?
Thank you, and fantastic question. I'd like just to mention something in adding a point to what Twasima is saying and answer a question that has been brought up about, like, why are labels important and why do we need them in our lives, and how they now reflect the question you have asked. I think as a person who identifies as queer, I have found myself more often than not having to answer, why do we need all those letters and why do we need to have them? So I think the problem is that we as human beings, we find it difficult to comprehend things that don't fit into these pre-made boxes that we have found and that society has provided us with. You know, I might not be for the idea of young feminism, but in regards to what I do as a person, I do it because they are young people problems, you know? You don't, and also I think that's when in organizations I've seen why people are labeled young people. It's because more often than not, how young people view problems is different from a different generation. And I think that is the reason why Twasima is pushing the idea that we need to call it radical feminism. Because from my perspective, the people who came before me and how Srilata has been saying it from a mentoring perspective is that ideally some of these problems were there. 40 years down the line, we're still facing the same problem. Take a thing like gender-based violence. It was there and it is still there. So we are like, how do we, as a young person or as a person who's a Generation Z or X, do this in terms of a way that affects me on a daily basis and how I perceive the problem? So you find that the way to do that is you're like, I can not do what everybody has been doing. They have been trying to legislate, but there's no proper implementation. So that doesn't work. So that's why I need more radical ideas. I need something that is out of this box and something that has not been thought of before. And to other people, that's where they perceive you as radical. Twasima can relate to this. in the sense that you are always told when you speak about, like me, when I speak in certain places, I'm like, I have never thought of a problem like that. You know, when we are like, we can be able to fundraise through crowdfunding and we can be able to rally people online. People are like, wow. And I'm like, to me, that's normal. That's how we do things. But to other people, it's different. So in terms of like transformative change, I think the whole idea is that the problem is not even the labels. The problem is not even the age. The problem is these predetermined notions and these predetermined concepts that are there. And that is what we need to address. Yes, I see you want to ask a thing.
I want to bring in one thing, and then there's also a question in the chat, which I find really interesting, and I would like to invite Twasima to react to, but also then to bring in Srilata again. But my point is, going back to Twasima's point about it's not only about grassroots activism, it's the categories, the boxes are transformed or are reflected in public policies and decision making. Let's say the electoral age. So, and that obviously is part of a very rigid power structure. If people younger than 18 are not invited to vote or not permitted to vote, then automatically a whole layer of people with needs, perceptions, realities are excluded from decision making. So we may refuse to acknowledge these boxes or categories and say we are not accepting pre-made boxes, but we have to accept them as they limit possibilities of political participation. So Twasima, yes, did you see the question posed by Yelena in the chat? And then we'll also bring in Srilata again, but Twasima, you go first.
Okay, so I am a feminist who right now, if you're using very specific measurements, is young. I'm not a young feminist. You know what I mean? And the language is important, and those are two different things, right? My politics are not young because I have invested in growing and nurturing and living them, right? It's not true that only young people are automatically radical. Sylvia Tamale, my law school professor and friend, is, you know, well into her 60s, and she's still one of the most radical people I know. So it's not a question of age, right? Exactly. I think most importantly, it's a question of praxis. It's a question of radical imagination of what can be. It's a refusal of the status quo. It's a willingness to continue to evolve and to understand that your politics must evolve. They cannot be stagnant, right? That is what creates the difference when people who are considered younger feminists show up in the space and they are unwilling to compromise and they are unwilling to, you know, massage the status quo, and others who perhaps argue and say, yeah, we've been here long enough. We know the power structures currently work for you. You've managed. You've learned how to navigate them, and that makes you comfortable. And that makes you. I don't think that a lot of times it's true that, you know, I think simply just based off our own life journeys, that you find that most of those people who were willing to have those hard conversations happen to be younger people. I don't think that it's necessarily true, right? I also think that even while we are alive to like the systems that we operate in, our feminist intention and our feminist obligation to ourselves and to each other must be to resist those, right? Like if in our institute, yeah, okay, it could be true that nationally those power structures exist based on age, but then why do we feel the need to replicate them in our own feminist organizations and in the ways in which we deal with each other, right? It's not true that we must copy and paste. Actually, if anything, we need to be doing everything to not be that way. And yet we very quickly get into those patterns, right? And we very quickly, in my opinion, get into those patterns because we are unwilling to challenge the status quo and the power structures, even when we acknowledge that ultimately that's what feminism is about.
Srilata, as someone who has certainly been able to maintain a great level of radicalism, what's your reaction to it, and how can we evade these boxes?
Well, first of all, I want to start by, I think, responding to, the various points, these very sort of powerful and nuanced points that Marlies and Twasima have raised. Let me start.
Is she frozen, or can you still hear her?
No, I think she's frozen, Silke.
Oh
Okay.
dear.
Are you back, Srilata?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, my internet is acting up today. I'm not sure why. Yeah, so, just do this or something if you can't hear me, because I don't know. I'm continuing to talk. Yeah, so what I wanted to say was that I think one of the reasons why our spaces have reproduced all these power structures is because despite the rhetoric of the personal is political, which we've had for the last, century almost, actually, we don't see ourselves as sites of change. It's that simple. We are ready to fix the world. We are ready to challenge all the power structures out there, but not to look at where do I sit in that power structure? Where have I internalized the values and the biases and the attitudes of that power structure? Where does that power structure sit inside me? And until you recognize yourself as a site of change, there isn't a hope in hell of creating feminist spaces that mirror the values of feminism. So my approach to this was very simple, that I cannot be a hypocrite and say we can create this more just and equitable world, for women, for trans people, for people with disabilities, for sex workers, for all those who are very excluded. I can't even dare to say that if I can't give people a glimpse of what that more just world might look like inside my own space. So we didn't treat ourselves as a space and a site for change. We treated ourselves as existing to change them, to change that structure, to change that world outside, as though that world wasn't residing right here in our hearts and in our minds. So I think that is partly why Marlies said, what is radical? I think there are some very good ways in which it has been defined already in this conversation. But I do want to add one more thing, and that is a framework that Kriya has increasingly used with a lot of political consciousness, which is of exclusion. Because exclusion is a very intersectional concept, because the ways in which you're excluded, can sometimes, there are sites where a whole bunch of power structures are intersecting and creating the exclusion, where stigma, for instance, is a form of exclusion. Yeah. So I think we have to also think of what is radical as including the concept of exclusion as very powerful and very necessary. I have some things to say about questions that have been raised in this question time, but I'll come to those later. I just want to end with one thing, which is that in my own experience of dealing with this issue of age and so on, starting with this consciousness of the self as a site of change, I made a very critical decision in my sort of mid 40s or even earlier, that I would no longer assume any positions of formal authority, but that I would consciously seek to work under other feminists, most of whom were younger. Okay, so in AVID, my boss, the director of AVID, Lydia Alpazar, was the same age as my son. And my immediate supervisor, Cindy Clark, was younger than my daughter. Yeah. But I wanted to experiment for myself with how do you feel powerful without occupying a position of formal power and authority. So that's the thing I want to really close my remarks with on this question, which is coming back to the self, that I think we have to find ways, we have to find or discover that the more you share power, the more powerful you become, one, but also that there are multiple ways of being powerful. I feel extremely powerful today. I don't occupy any position of formal power or authority, but I feel very powerful. Yeah, because I feel heard. I feel valued. I feel the work I've done in a non-authority position has been very empowering to people, and that makes me feel, so I feel we don't allow ourselves, because of these structures that Twasima and Marlies were talking about, we almost imagine that there's no other way to be powerful except to be in power. Let me stop there.
I love this. The more you share power, the more powerful you become.
I've said this many times.
I want to turn to Marlies, but bring in a comment or two comments that have been raised in the chat that relate to the question that, I mean, even agreeing with your approach, Srilata, of seeing the self or, as a site of change, and the refusal to accept categories as was said before, but the political structures and the economic structures we're moving and operate with categories. Somebody said the categories help us structure the breakdown complexity, Kim said in the comments. And then somebody referred to or brought the question of accountability as formal structures, and also the decision-making structures, and how to ensure youth participation when we say age stratification is not a concern. So Marlies, how can we consider ourselves as sites of change and still deal with the fact that economic and political realities are categorized and do categorize us as actors beyond our individual environment? You're muted.
Sorry about that. Sites of change and how economic disparities affect us all. It's coming from South Africa and having spent much of my teenagehood and adult life there, there's no place where such disparities of economy and wealth are more clear than in South Africa. So at this point in time, when you are trying to change your own community and effect and bring up certain things that you think will help your own community, you have to first understand the privileges you have yourself. So for you to consider yourself a site of change, I think is the best part to start is having an honest conversation with yourself. Only that then can you be able to reflect this to the larger society. You know, when we say that we are facing people who live under $1 a day or $2 a day, and there's people who have billions sitting in offshore accounts, and the same people are the ones who are running for office and becoming our presidents, you know? So the question is more so, how do we get to be equal in a society that is such? And you find that all these problems are rooted in colonialism. So it's colonialism that has extended into modern times in countries that were colonized, in the sense of that when we talk about how we are divided in terms of like society, you find that when you're trying to do activism, the people who live in the upside of town face different challenges to the people who face this other side of town. So when you want to affect the change, you must be able to know who your base is and who you are trying to reflect this change upon. You cannot be going to a township and you're trying to speak about problems about that the government is taxing people who earn over 400,000 more. Like, these are large numbers that people don't even understand in their own lives. And the only thing that these people are asking for is clean water, sanitation, and to be able to put food on their table. So how we can be sides of change in our own self is having to be honest, is having to be able to answer the question of what problems am I actually facing and what problems am I trying to solve and what kind of privileges do I possess? And this is a thing that pops up a lot in Germany. And people who do feminism do acknowledge the privileges they have if you're white and if you're rich. That is why sometimes I like to hear that. It's that helps us to have an honest conversation and understand that my privileges is rooted in a society and in a country that does very questionable businesses out there. And that's why I'm able to have a tram system that is always on time, you know, and in Africa, you don't have that. It's that we need to be able to have these honest conversations. And that is the problem we have when we try to bring certain conversations such as race, critical race theory, when we try to bring abortion. Some people don't want to have this honest conversation themselves and check themselves and say that we have this problem. So you are that person and you're a feminist. Help me understand that, how that makes sense, that you are saying that I am trying to change this, but when we have problems on this side, we don't have that, you know? So I will finish by saying that I encourage everybody to be able to check themselves first, because I do have those moments when I am standing in front of people to speak to them, to be able to say that you need to break that systems that oppress me. And I'm like, at this point in time, like, what privileges do I own? You know, like, how can I be telling people drink wine and I'm drinking water on this other side? So it's a question of how that personal principle reflects on your feminism and activism that can help you become a site of change for the better of society.
Still, Twasima, I want to bring you in your role also of somebody who's worked or who's working as in grant making, and to bridge this question of individual change and reflection about the individual position and the use of categories to ensure or transform political power, but also to the use of categories to channel money to transformative projects, maybe. And this is also maybe also Srilata can bring in some of her experience. How can we, on the one hand, question ourselves and consider ourselves in our environment as sites of change, and still operate with categories, or how can we transform institutions and official political power structures, and not lose that out of sight because we're too focused on considering ourselves as radical and not and trying to avoid the boxing of ourselves and others.
Okay, so I'm going to try and answer that question the best I can. First, I think that it's important to always remember that there is the individual and there's also the collective, right? The individual feeds into the collective, right? Which is why we always say the personal is political, because the personal choices that you make as someone who identifies as a feminist ultimately affect our collective ability to organize, to resist, to push back, right? So it's important to know that one feeds into the other. But we must not always lose track of the collective. Ultimately, what we're trying to do as people, and I really hope this is, and perhaps we need to have a conversation about if we all agree this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to transform power structures. What does that mean? What does it mean if we say we are divesting from white supremacy? What does that practically mean? What are the practical steps that you must take as a white feminist on a day-to-day? What does it mean if I am divesting from heterosexuality, right? And saying that I am an ally to the queer movement? What are the practical things that I must do as a cisgendered woman on a day-to-day to make sure that trans women feel safe and free, right? There's a collective, but there's also like the individuals. On a day-to-day, we make decisions that either regress or not. And I think it's important for us to be able to sit with those uncomfortable truths. The other thing is that I think that it's important for us to determine if we're here to save institutions or if we're here to dismantle and make new institutions. You know what I mean? Because I feel like sometimes it keeps, but maybe if we did this practical thing that would not tilt the power too much, it would not upset people too much, they would give us what we want. One, it's not true, because here we are, I don't know how many years later, right? And still doing things the same way, and still trying to massage people's egos, and still afraid of shaking the tables too much, and still in the same exact positions, right? Mm-hmm. My unpopular opinion is that I am not invested in institutions surviving. I am invested in us collectively surviving. And that's going to mean that some of these institutions must be dismantled. Ultimately, that's the bottom line. And I think that we are avoiding some of those difficult conversations. And so we're going in cycles, and we have seminars after seminars, and it's been 20, 30, 40 years, and we're promising the future, and the future is never coming, right? So what does it mean if we say that these power structures must be transformed? What does that mean? I think we're too invested in maintaining systems and maintaining institutions and not taking enough time to radically reimagine what else is possible and how we can be able to get there. I'm also an abolitionist, which means that on very many fronts, I am the radical, right? But it's been pushing me every single time I wake up. I say, what does social justice look like outside this very narrow definition, right? What does it mean if perhaps we invested enough in our communities and in each other that we didn't feel the need to fight over resources, that we didn't immediately see each other as threats? And sometimes those look like fluffy, imaginary, those are not possible. And because we keep saying that there's no way that works in the real world, there's no way that works in the real world, we're not investing enough in actually taking those ideas out of our minds and beginning to test them out here and there, right? And that's a problem, and that's a failing. I would not like for us to be having the same conversations in 50 years. So something has to give.
I think you're right, but so I was wondering, like, how the shaking the table and the are we saving institutions brings me to one comment in the chat where somebody says, I can't read the name at the moment, the choice to move away from power comes with the privilege of access to power, and how it's an interesting contradiction in feminism that some people are fighting to access decision-making power and others are more invested in shaking the table and transforming the structures as such. And it made me think Marlise's point at the very beginning, daily problems do not need board meetings. Yes, but if all board meetings are dominated by a tiny group of people, then how can we shake the table appropriately and disrupt the board meeting to stay in this image? Srilata, what is your reaction to this comment that the choice to move away from power comes with a certain privilege of access to power?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I was just writing in the chat pane that my decision to move out of formal positions of power partly came out of that recognition that I had the privilege of doing that. I had the privilege and capacity to do that, because of economic security and the fact that I had accessed those positions because of historical advantages, because of my caste, though I don't come from a very upper caste or anything, but nevertheless a more privileged caste and so on. And part of the reason that I moved out of those positions was because I really wanted the space to be taken by, for instance, in my context, Dalit women leaders, many of whom had emerged and risen up during our movement building process. But what so I don't want to minimize or deny that the privilege of giving up power, as Sunita Rani has so beautifully put it here, comes with having had it. But there are still people who are struggling to gain access to formal decision-making spaces, and they are, always excluded from those spaces, or they are included in a tokenistic way without any real voice. And these are very real problems. But what I did want to say is that I find it very problematic, this whole question of categories and identities, and when do we need them and when do we need to go beyond them? So I want to respond to that, which I think is a larger question that's looming in the conversation. Yeah, are categories necessary? So I think the first thing we have to do in considering this question is to get out of this either or binary. That yes, categories are necessary, no, they are not necessary. The fact is, we can't look at it that way. That's a very polarized binary way of approaching it. So at one level, categories are essential because they are a matter of historical justice, they're a matter of feminist justice, they're a matter of human rights. Yeah, we need categories to address the historical exclusion, oppression, stigmatization of a range of people based on their identities, locations, religion, race, caste, ethnicity, ability, etc., etc. But we also, I hope I'm still audible. Mm-hmm. We
Again,
also have to create spaces where people can learn to work together beyond those categories and identities. And we begin to create spaces where we relate to each other from our essential humanity, from the different capacities and strengths and abilities and passions that we bring to that space, where we can regard each other as fellow travelers on a shared journey of transformation. So it's not that in those spaces these other categories have disappeared. But if we only have representation based on category, then at one level, we'll just continually reinforce them. This has been the old debate about affirmative action and quotas and so on, yeah? But the point is we need quotas, and then we need spaces that go beyond quotas, where those who've entered through the quotas and those who are there because of historic privilege begin to learn to relate to each other beyond that, yeah? Through shared visions, shared, a sense of justice, shared, agendas of change. So I really believe that we have to stop looking at this as an either or question and look at these as both essential to the transformation agenda. And I know this is possible. In fact, I'm delighted that a colleague, a very long-standing colleague from the days when we both worked together in building a movement of pavement and slum dwellers in Bombay City, that was the most fantastic movement, because being pavement dwellers created a frame. So this is the thing, how do we create frames that enable people to come together with all their diversity and in this intersecting way around a shared agenda of change? We had sex workers as leaders of that movement. We had trans women in leadership in that movement. We had street children. These are children who've run away from their homes in various rural areas and living also on the street. All of them had a space in that movement. All of them had a voice.
So is this, I find this extremely interesting. I mean, there are a few things that I wanted to highlight. One is somebody put in the chat, inactivity is a choice in favor of the status quo, which I liked very much. So there's an urgency. There's always been an urgency, but I feel like the awareness of the urgency of our own survival as humanity is maybe now greater than ever before, even though it seems to not have reached the global north as much as it should. But there is an urgency, a sense of urgency, and inactivity is a choice in favor of the status quo. And I very much support your point about creating spaces, Srilata. And in connection with this creating frames, that brings me back to Marlise's start of the daily problems as real life realities as frames for joint action beyond categories, or where people of very different categories who share needs can in fact come together. Could this be a way of how to interpret the idea of intersectional action or intersectional feminism? My question, who would like to respond? Twasima, Marlise, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I would like for us to move intersectional approach, just basically the word away from the buzzword that it has seemingly become, right? It's now a very, I don't know, it's like replacing gender mainstreaming. Like everywhere you go, everyone is trying to be intersectional, you know what I mean? But like, what does that actually mean, right? So feminism is a political movement. And I think that sometimes we forget that it's a political movement rooted in political ideology. It has theory backed at it. It has praxis, right? So intersectionality is also very much a political word, right? So the praxis of it, aside from the buzzwords that it has become that we use in meetings such as this, like what does it translate into, right? I think that we must be able to, I think, especially as someone who works now in grant making, I think a lot about what shifting the power means. What does it mean to actually shift the power, and how do I translate that on my day-to-day intersectional praxis, right? It means that I must be able to put my money where my mouth is. So are we funding radical, young, disabled, queer African people who don't look like us, who make us uncomfortable, who come into these spaces and refuse to be respectable, right? Are we funding the work that needs to be done? Because we who have power and we who have access and recognize that must ask ourselves what it is that we are contributing to ultimately transforming the systems, right? For me, intersectional praxis looks like being able to ensure that because of my access and because of my power, right, I am able to first and foremost challenge the language in these spaces. I'm able to bring and fund and collect and organize for and with, right? At a community level, I think intersectionality means that we must actually be willing to show up for each other and actually living the talk. And many times we don't, because we're still, and this is, I think, also as I think about like some of the questions, I want to encourage us to like think beyond. Can we stop thinking beyond this box of what is possible, right? Let's blow it up and see what else we can be, right? Because a lot of times we can't see beyond, but how would this work? Because this structure is still so limited. Yeah, this structure is limited, we acknowledge, but let's blow it open and begin brick by brick to lay what we want to see. Right? I am more invested in now feminist conversations saying, okay, we have talked like this is the kind of world that we're aspiring to, and these are the ways in which we are building towards it. We're not waiting anymore for someone to give us permission. We don't even have the time to wait, honestly, right? We're taking it and we are showing up for each other and for ourselves in this way and in small ways and in big ways. And we are building communities with each other. And we are, shifting the ways in which power works in our own institutions and in our own families. And we're replicating that. And where we have access, we're speaking up. So it's very small and big gestures that are ultimately going to determine whether we survive or not.
I would like to hand over to Marlies, but remind you that unfortunately our time is almost up. So, but yeah, Marlies, what is your reaction to the creation of spaces and the breaking of and the creation of frames and the commitment to feel uncomfortable? I like that part of Twasima, which the commitment to feel or to support those that make you feel uncomfortable maybe comes with the questioning of privileges as well.
Thank you so much. I'll try to be quick here. I think the biggest question is when we mention about concepts like intersectionality, about power privileges and how these frameworks work. Like I said it before, it's these pre-made boxes that I have been there for so much, and they're the ones that I used to draft and build these policies. So they are the baseline of all these things that you see right now. When I say pre-made boxes, I'm talking in the concept of things like, oh, sometimes when it comes to certain things, we need a president, let's say, of a nation to be above 35 years old. And like Twasima said, in Uganda, the median age is 15 years old. That is why you see now people in power bringing ideas that we need to put a tax on internet, where for young people, it's the eureka moment that we have gotten to have. So these frameworks that are there and how we are committed to change and checking our responsibilities and who we support ideally comes to what you decide to do as a person. I refuse to be on board with a certain idea from my company, not because I am more so worried about losing my job, but I am so worried about losing what I have and what my conscience is, and that is where we become change makers. Change starts with where you do, and that is the beginning of it. So the most important thing at this point of work and challenging frameworks is for people to be encouraged to speak up, for people to be told that you don't talk too much, that you think you always know everything, that in turn we are doing the opposite. If you feel somebody perhaps is going in this direction, maybe guide them. And that's the most important thing that we need to do. So in terms of like now checking our policy, checking our privileges in regards to all this, is the question of who do you decide to support with your power? You know, democracy sometimes is a fallacy that lies to us to tell us that the power lies with the people. So if the power lies with the people, then why do we see more right-wing government at this point in time coming into power? You know, where does all these things come in? It's because that we find that there are these problems that are being used to steer a conversation. You know, refugees are being used as political talking points. You know, and it's for people now in small, let's say like here in Europe, you find like small communities that never saw this before. Politicians are targeting these small communities. And how we can challenge that framework and not to be on board with it is by actually addressing the problem. Refugees are not political talking points. Germany does not declare how much money officially it makes for sales of arms, but journalists have been able to prove time and again that weapons are being found in Africa. Weapons are being found in the Middle East where these wars are ravaging, and these people now are being forced to come back here. And we are not having that conversation in that sense. So, yes.
Sorry, I need to, I'm looking at the time.
Yes, so sorry. It's
I'm
passion.
sorry.
It's passion. Alles klar. Thank you.
And in the chat, there's a whole new conversation has been opened by a comment that Yelena made, which I take also as, are we too much are we being too ignorant of clashes and conflicts that do exist between different generations of feminists in our circle, in our conversation over here? Yeah, what are the points of clashes? I feel like this is a whole new conversation for another hour and a half at least. But I wanted to give Srilata a chance for at least a last comment, since we have to come to a close now. Are we being too ignorant of the confrontations and the clashes between feminists in our conversation here? What are the controversies?
Well, it's unfortunate that this has come right at the end, because I certainly came prepared to talk about it, what I experienced and what I've seen and watched, and what many activists have, shared with me over the years. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why CREA has such a strong, strategy of reaching out and working with younger, chronologically speaking, feminist activists around the world. I don't think, we really need to describe it. I think we all know, in Latin America, they call them the tias, the aunties, all the different forms of control, access to the donors, access to all the representational spaces, etc. But I think I feel great joy and pride in seeing how a lot of that power has been shaken, at least in my context. Yeah. And I think the kinds of very powerful, very innovative, very different kinds of movements and movement building that have emerged with whole new generation of activists, which are almost rendering some of these, older approaches and strategies irrelevant, but also the way they're redefining, like just to give one example in our context, in my generation, my act of defiance of, feminist fundamentalism, as I used to call it, was wearing lipstick, because I was dismissed as I she can't be a feminist because she wears lipstick. Now, it's not that, obviously one can give a whole political analysis of lipstick and so on. But my point was that this dismissal of pleasure, the dismissal of the personal sense of wellness and well-being, etc. That's a classic generational divide. And, you'll always hear older feminists very often in my context saying, now they want the weekend off and they want to party and they want to, enjoy. It's like, how terrible they want to enjoy themselves. That's really awful, isn't it? So politically uncommitted, because, unless you've killed yourself for the movement, you're not serious. You're not really committed. I mean, there are so many of these differences, but I don't want to, really dwell on that, which I think is fairly obvious. But I think the point is that more and more, thanks to the voices of younger feminists, thanks to the work done, the innovations created by networks like Ebert and raising these issues internationally, I think there's much more consciousness today about this than there was. And, I just feel that this is a passage. We'll pass through it. And I think, if we have the voices of the Twasimas and the Marlises and thousands of others I could name, they're just going to walk past this issue, in a certain way. And, taking us into new spaces and new ways of organizing and even imagining the problems and the whole out-of-box thinking. So personally, I'm very hopeful. I remember a quote, Marlies was talking about democracy as the fallacy. Claude Ake, the famous Nigerian, the late Claude Ake, famous Nigerian scholar, he called democracy the modest privilege of protection from the power of the state. So that's the best we can expect from it, and the worst we can expect from it we're witnessing all around the world. Yeah. So I just say, let's keep walking. Let's take the journey forward.
Thank you. I'm very happy to know that we will keep the conversation going. There are 2 more webinars already agreed on, and please come and join us again for today. I think, unfortunately, we need to come to an end today with this. Some of you said the commitment to be made feel uncomfortable and the commitment to enjoy yourself, the commitment to shake the table and to break power structures while not losing the joy of it and while not stopping the party. So thank you for today. Thanks, Marlies. Thanks, Twasima. Thanks, Srilata. Thanks to all the people in the background who organized and monitored the chat and helped us connect in this way. And yes, let me remind you of the upcoming 2 other webinars on the 16th of November and the 30th of November. We really look forward to joining with you again. Thanks to all the participants who were with us over the last hour and a half. I very much look forward to seeing you all again. But really, most of all, thanks, Marlies, thanks, Twasima, thanks, Srilata, and our wonderful interpreters for giving us a voice. Please do stay in touch. And on behalf of FAS and White Plus, I would like to thank you for being with us here today. And I look forward to keeping up the conversation and the commitment to creating spaces of engagement and exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.